Welcome to Human Systems Engineering 542, Module 4, Part 3. Today we're going to discuss controls and how people use controls to control their system and what we need in those controls to help them to do that better. So the design considerations for what we will discuss in our discrete controls will be related to the topics that we've mentioned previously, which are our attention, perception, memory, mental models, which is the 4 that we discussed in the last video. But we will also be adding one called response selection controls. And these are some other considerations that we need to consider when designing these controls for our users. So why do we need controls in the first place? Well, controls, you can think about it as a remote control car, a remote control for your TV. You can think about it as an external way to input information into the system, rather to control the system. And what we use the controls for on the users is how they will use the, sorry, my husband's calling, it's really throwing me off. Okay. Geesh Louise. All right, restart this slide right here. Okay. So why do we need controls? Our users need a way to offer input to the system to control the system. And you can think about this when you think about a remote control, or you could, for your, maybe your race car, or you use the remote control for your TV. But we need a way to allow feedback from the user. So if the user is controlling the system, they need to input an action of some sort. If it's a button, a press, or if it is a knob turn, not only do they need to control the system and know how to do that, but they need to know what decision they're going to be making and then perform the action. So the control is really the doing. When you control a system, it means you're actually doing something, an action or an input to add to the system to get some kind of output, right? If I hit enter or if I hit play, then I would expect that the system would respond and then do that. Some of the theory that they talk about for this type of process is called the information processing model. And that is where, again, the user needs to know what it is that they're supposed to do, decide, which we talked a lot about, decision, and then do. And that do, again, is the action. That's the control here. So here's some types of discrete controls that we can talk about, which are knobs, levers, buttons, switches. Keyboards is also a discrete control, and voice input, which is kind of a newer type of control. And these are different than continuous controls, which we'll talk about in the last part of Module 4. Continuous controls vary because you have to continually track and monitor. So the discrete controls is you flip a switch, you rotate the knob, and you hopefully are provided an output right away based on your input. So through the design, we can control the speed in which someone would respond. We can also try to control their accuracy, and based on the design, those types of things can be accounted for. And in design, we also have to be mindful that there's a lot of complexity with control systems. Again, that our brains are heavily taxed when we're doing a lot of different things, and we need to make sure that we're not putting so much pressure and stress, and that the displays are clear. And some of those main things we've talked about in design already are also accounted for, but that we need to be mindful that there's also other controls that they might have to push, and that their hand might not be free because they're trying to crank something in the corner. I'm imagining, you know, kind of a crazy cockpit where there's a lot of things going on and you can't be hitting buttons every second. And that if they are, that we're mindful of how complex the system is. So the best configuration for discrete controls comes from your textbook, because again, this is not something that is coming out of the woodwork. This is stuff that's been tested for a lot of time. But it does talk about in figure 9.1 in your book that 2 states, if it has an on-off, if that's kind of what you're going for here, that it's a push button or a lever, then a toggle switch. So that's the one that has the on-off, where you're kind of flipping it up and down. If the best configuration for entering text that comes from this figure 9.1 is that the keyboard would be preferred, then the voice would be the second kind of best. And if you have sequential states where you're having to do something in a certain order, that you have this device that looks like a selector switch. And so these are just kind of the main things that come from that figure. And again, depending on what you're designing for, there's already been research out there to suggest which one would be the best, kind of the preferred. So in the two states on off with the push button as being the best one, the first best, then the lever, then toggle switch. The push button is great only if there's things like an indicator light, and only if you can physically see it depressed or not depressed. Just like these green, red, and yellow buttons, if it's kind of in that on position, what is the on position? And something that is interesting with these configurations is that age can play a role here. So on our iPhones specifically, they took away what we used to know as the home key. And in the home key, it used to be a physical circle that you could toggle on and off, and you could feel it if it was kind of pushed. You could feel yourself pushing it in, but if the phone was in a dead state, the button you could play around with it, but it didn't respond. Now we feel like the home button is there because they have integrated into our phones with a tactile vibration in the newer designs. I don't know how new your phone is, but hopefully you understand what I'm talking about, that if I were to turn my phone completely off, which I will here, hopefully you can see it, there's actually no home button anymore, which people used to put here. These buttons too have haptic feedback, so if I push the camera button, you can feel that vibration, that's the feedback. Well, people were so used to that home button, it had that response that when it was actually in the dead state, so it was completely turned off, that button then was gone, and it kind of tripped people out that there was no real button there because it felt so real. And sometimes, based on how old you are maybe and how used to newer technology and displays, that can play a role with those types of changes on phones. And again, they're trying to accommodate that need for the home button to be there. Before this model, that was one of the things that we relied on to know if it was in the on or off state. Now, with other considerations are that older people, a lot of their world was a little bit more forceful. So it was a crank, and it was a pull, and it was a push. And if it didn't work, you kind of tapped on it 3 times and really made it work. And you could kind of jiggle the wires and make a response. And so that generation is a little bit more used to like the physical pushing, the flip switches, those types of real grounded notifications that they actually controlled the system, and they can see it in a redundant manner because they see the switch flipped and they feel it and all those things. But as the world becomes more tactile and haptic, it's not as, and the displays and the interfaces are more tech savvy, it's not always easy to know if the response was given, if the touch was accepted. Maybe they can't really feel if it vibrates their finger back, so they don't know what state they're in. So in the configuration for discrete controls, there are still probably a lot of research that needs to be done to figure out how age can play a role, and as our technology changes, what types of configurations will be best. As your book did before, that has these 15 guidelines, these basic design principles for your attention, perception, memory, and mental models, and this response selection consideration specific to controls. You also need to consider the environment. You need to consider the location of the controls, the type, and the size. These can aid in appropriate inputs to the system. So placing them the right size, putting them in the right place to the user can help, again, create more accuracy with your user to the system. So when it comes to the attention, the control guidelines here would be proximity. So it's helpful to have the controls near the relevant display. So if I'm going to be controlling something in this field of vision, that the buttons are also somewhere in my field of view, not hidden underneath. So for example, the desk I'm standing at right now, in order to move it up or down, I know my hand comes over here, but I actually can't really feel which button's which, so now I need to look to see which one I'm pressing. So it's kind of out of my sight, even though I mean, there's really where else to put it, and you'll see that there's going to be trade-offs here on where you put those controls, and it's, you know, it's assuming I'm right-handed, as most people are, and that if I need to control it, that I can push these buttons up and down, and maybe if I used it long enough, I would memorize or be able to feel. But both buttons on the up and down arrow have the same tactile representation. They both have a bump out, and so I really can't tell which one is up or down. It would be nice if maybe the up was popped out and the down was popped in, so I could really feel the difference. But nonetheless, the proximity that the controls are near the display as much as you can, as easily as possible. So for this in particular, this desk, is it pertinent that it's right in my field of vision all the time? No, because I don't need that all the time. It's not something I'm constantly using. But if it's something that I need more frequently, then I'm going to need it near the display. You also want to avoid resource competition. So if I need my hands, and I'm talking with my hands to give this presentation, and for some reason I need my desk to move up, it would maybe be nice if I could allow voice to control it. So that is more the tech world we're going into, where we're asking Google and Siri to do all these things. You know, I generally have my hands full when I walk into the house, but I can say, hey, Google, turn on the lights. Hey, Google, do this. And that voice control command helps with the resource competition where I actually physically can't touch anything right at the moment because I'm doing something else. So for the attention's sake, those are some guidelines in the controls. The attention example, as I already said, was Siri and Google. And car activation voice control, if your hands are being used, it's really helpful because you want 10 and 2 on the steering wheel. And the issue here is to think about the ways that this could fail. With voice, we probably are more familiar with how it fails more than how it works well, and they're improving it constantly. But vocabulary has to all be included, accents, slang. It has to account for different noise of the environment, and again, stress. You might change your inflection of your voice, or you might be speaking too fast and it's not registering. So when it comes to controlling it with your voice, it's very helpful, but again, those are some considerations to the design that you have to consider. When it comes to just perception, how are you going to access the controls, and how are you going to know which control to touch? It's helpful that you make it discriminable, meaning that you consider that location, shape, size, operation, label, and color. And there is a guideline in your textbook that goes into those considerations. But what is the most helpful is that, you know, it's close to what it's operating, and that it's accessible to everyone. This is physically and with their maneuverability. So if I, again, put something, you think about it on your TV when you need to get to the back panel, right? It's kind of like this bulky thing to try to get back there and, you know, plug in the right cord, or on your computer to plug in that right cord. It's not very easily done. And again, you might need to also consider handicaps or something depending on your users, you know, what size they are, how high can they reach, all sorts of things perceptually for the controls. Redundancy gain is helpful. So again, as I said here before, on this desk, I have a physical bump out for where the button is, along with the light, and that helps me. I can see it when I look at it, which one's up and down, and I can feel that there's something there for up and down, but it would be nice if there was also a discrepancy there, a discrimination between which one is the up and down based on the bump outs. Also, you want to make sure that perceptually that you're avoiding absolute judgment limits, where you're not asking someone to be super specific in how they're judging what it is that they're controlling. So making sure that you're not, an absolute judgment would be like, what's the exact temperature of this room right now? That they're not doing those types of things when they're trying to perceive the control, so that we're avoiding anything that they would have to kind of be precise at. And one of the ways that we can do this is called detents, which these are kind of built-in stops that require extra force to be able to pass. So you can think about it in a car when you're changing, my car when I'm driving, and if it tries to, I swerve out of my lane and it tries to kind of push me back, I need to give it extra force to actually do what I wanted to do, to control it the way I wanted to. And so that is basically requiring that I'm truly paying attention to override what it thinks I'm doing, right? So if I were to be doing a remote surgery and I was performing a surgery and I had new technology that I was kind of cutting into somebody with my imaginary stuff, but the machine, the Da Vinci or something like that, was doing it across the world, and it was taking in my, basically my pressure and all the stuff that I'm giving it. We want to make sure that if I really needed to push extra hard on the machine or something like that, that it would kind of force me to make that decision that I needed to force pass. So some examples of perception would be that you can do this without looking, that you can operate it blind. So that's always a helpful principle to follow for your users, is that could they do this if they couldn't see at all? When we think about the keyboard, you can feel those raised F and J keys, and so you could do this without looking. I can type with my eyes closed because of that. I know where my fingers are. Make your controls accessible and you know, account for the color and the size and the shape. Identifiable, so I know, oh yeah, the FN is the blue one. If I press that, that's going to allow me access to the F keys at the top. Discriminable, so you know which one's which. That makes sense to the user. The relevant information that you are using to control are kept within a short distance of each other. So again, that's that proximity where they're kind of in an area that makes sense, that's as close as possible without getting them super confused. If you're creating something for a user that has kind of a mitigated perception, so they're not able to feel as well with their fingers, maybe they have arthritis, or maybe they just don't have enough strength to actually turn the valve for the hose, consider glove use or some other way that they can still control it with like an additional support. And again, redundant information. So if indicator lights are really helpful. We use them all the time on our electronic devices. It tells us the status. So if it's a green light, it's on and ready to go. If it's red, we know that's it's off or maybe in standby. Again, red can mean different things. But if that indicator light is washed or burned out, then you don't know if it is on or off. And so that can really mess with the user. So having another form of information to notify them of the status without relying on just the light. So if the light burns out, are we in on or off position? That's always really helpful to have that. Memory control guidelines. Memory, again, follow the knowledge in the world. So keep your buttons and levers in a position that reflects the state of the system. So this one, as we get into more gestures and controls with our bodies, these might not be super intuitive. So I know on Macs they have a lot of ways that you can control the screen with different gestures. We all know kind of the pinch and the expand and up and down, and we have the trackpad that can help us to do that. But as you get into other ones with swiping 4 fingers this way to kind of move your screen, and then again, probably a lot of you know way more gestures than I do. Those don't tend to be super intuitive out the gate. Those are something that someone might have to teach you, those different gestures. But when you're designing the controls, try to be as consistent as possible with others. Again, intuitively, if you're scrolling down or up, that you're kind of going the way that you think you're going. If you're pinching and dragging, that it mirrors kind of you backwards, right? But that the user feels like they're controlling the world in front of them. We also don't want to tax the memory for the user. So display lights are helpful. This one telling you to check your engine oil soon is telling you through a display light. So you don't have to remember that it went on and then it goes off. That would be really, really hard to keep track of, but it actually stays on until you complete the goal of getting your oil changed, and redundancy here as well. Mental models, we want to always match the user to how they think it should be controlled and designed. So location should be near that being controlled. That sounds a lot like proximity. And the direction is congruent with movement. So I just actually was in one of these the other day, and you have two joysticks and neither one tells you which one is which. So through a little bit of trial and error, you can figure out this one means go, this one means go back, and this one's kind of turn left or right. Even though you're going forward or backward, it's left or right. And if you do them both at the same time, you end up kind of doing a donut. But that, my movement going forward matches with what I think intuitively of going forward. When you're standing on a hoverboard, your toes down kind of pushes you forward, and going back kind of stops you. So that those basic concepts of up, down, right, left are matching how the joystick and such is being used. The last control guideline that is newer for specific control is that response selection. So again, we have situations where there's a lot of controls, there's a lot of complex decision making, and we want to help the user to make the correct choices by reducing the amount of options they have. So they did find that a small amount of complex decisions is better than many small decisions. Okay, so a small amount of complex decisions would be better than just continually making a bunch of little ones. So again, there's a push-pull here with the complexity and what it is you're trying to accomplish with your user. But sometimes, instead of pushing this button, then this button, then this button, and you're just making 100 little decisions, it's easier to kind of be overarching and make a few bigger decisions with the information you have at hand. You also want to always, always, always provide feedback to your user instantaneously, as fast as you can, that the input was received, that the change is happening. Harmful feedback would be something like your voice on audio. So when you're on a phone call and you hear the feedback of your voice, that's harmful feedback because it distracts you from speaking. So you have to be careful on your feedback. It has to be instantaneous but not distracting. And it has to be reliable, and it'd be helpful if it made a sound, a click or a snap, or some type of confirmation that the information was received. Something that's kind of difficult is when you have, let's say, an air conditioning that you push up, up, up for heat, and it has a delay with how long it takes to send the signal to the unit to turn it on or off and how long that takes. So sometimes people just kind of continually push, 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 push because they don't feel that response fast enough. Another thing with response selection, which your book talks heavily about, is avoiding accidental activation. That means that someone doesn't actually bump it or hit it by accident and trigger the wrong thing. And I always think of the giant big red button that says don't push, or the emergency button that's sitting out that everyone wants to kind of hit, but obviously will shut down the whole facility, so never touch that button. And there's a few things here you have to consider. Locate and orient it, so separate it from the routine. The placement of that important, vital, whatever control it is, needs to be strategically placed so that if I needed to go activate something or send help for the masses, that I actually walk out and make that decision. It's not something I bump. If it is something that's kind of in your field that you're working on, recess and shield, protect it from the bump, or have an extra step that you actually have to kind of pull it out of position to then put it in, kind of like a safety lock, or an interlock and sequence. So you actually have to make a certain action to activate it. You have to know the code. And so you want to also resist, delay, and confirm. So this would be something when you set up this emergency button or this whatever control that's super important, but you don't want it to get bumped and you've put it away, you've shielded as much as you can, that it's more than just a light touch, that you have to actually give it your all, or it's something that's resistive to you. So when you're pushing, it's resisting back so that, hey, I really do need this right now. So you have to give it more oomph. And if it's like on a computer display and they're saying, yeah, sure, I want to delete all my pictures, that they say okay again, that there's a confirmation. Are you really sure about that decision before you confirm it? With response selection, there is Fitts law, which we take into account, which is the concept of Fitts law is that when the distance to the controls increases, the difficulty and movement time also increases. So if it's further away from me, it's going to take longer and it might be more difficult to get to it to make the correct decision. We have to consider the distance between our fingers on a keyboard on different phones. That's what we have here. The space between the keys on the phones, based on the size of the phone, has a little bit different layout for your thumbs, and the spacing matters. And Fitts law talks a lot about is the mathematics to say, okay, if it's this far away from you, this is how, the time accounted for it to control it. So nothing that you have to memorize here, but just be familiar that Fitts law is something you'll hear a lot about in your futures. So in summary, we interact with controls every day. They've been around us for quite some time, and they are changing as our technology and our world changes. Our controls can be controlled, which really means designed well. We can better design the controls to fit our users. These considerations follow that similar flow for cognitive psychology: attention, perception, mental models, memory, and response selection. We want to make sure that people control accurately and have high accuracy with the decisions that they need to make. Lastly, if the control is important and they need to respond with that control in a certain manner, or it needs to be hidden away so it doesn't get accidentally bumped, that the right safety precautions are there to keep it from being accidentally selected. This is how we will control our controls. Thank you.